And recently she has been working on the history of Ravenser Odd, a medieval island in the Humber that appeared in the 1230s and had disappeared by 1360. And in relation to our theme for today of Magna Carta and the changes that were developing and accelerating during the 13th century in the forms of governance of a country, then one aspect of that governance, as we know all too well, is that it requires an increasing amount of record keeping and an increasing amount of people in order to keep those records. And so we see the growth of a professional bureaucracy during the 13th century. And so we thought who better to talk about that than the head of medieval records at the National Archives. And so I've just about gone on long enough for Sophie to get back to her desk and to turn on Kathryn's microphone. Yes, Sophie? Right. Kathryn is now live. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Philip, for that lovely introduction. And thanks all of you for taking the time to come on a Saturday to hear such a range of wonderful papers. I'm very, very honoured to be here. I'm particularly honoured to be in such great company. David, Andrew, Helen and Paul's talks have been so good so far. I'm looking forward to Ian coming along after me. So genuinely, I'm really, really grateful to be here. So as Philip kindly introduced me, I'm the head of medieval records at the National Archives. And this, on my slide here, for those of you who've been into the repositories at the National Archives, you'll know that this is behind the scenes. So this in particular is the map section of the National Archives. So these are our big rolls. So I'm going to begin with a fuller version of the quote from which I took my title today, which comes from the first Deputy Keeper's Report of the Public Record Office in 1840. Francis Palgrave ends the report before the extremely lengthy appendix by addressing Queen Victoria directly, saying, "In concluding, I venture with all humility to observe that your Majesty's public records constitute a series of unparalleled completeness and antiquity. No other European state possesses consecutive archives commencing at so early a date or extending over so long a period of time. They exhibit the full development of the laws and institutions of your Majesty's realm and are evidence of the progress of society in the various changes which the policy of the nation has sustained." So I can't hope to compete with his beautiful Victorian rhetoric, but in this talk I am going to return to the beginning of some of those record series of unparalleled completeness and antiquity and ask what the increase in record keeping across the 13th century meant, both for government and for the individual. Are these records primarily useful for us, all of us as historians, or were they useful at the time, and in what way? How did writing things down, rather than remembering them, change English society and governance? As you know, because of Philip's kind intro, I am lucky enough to be Paul's boss, to work at the successor to the Public Record Office, the National Archives. If anyone's got any stories about Paul, do let me know afterwards. So we are the current custodian of these record series of unparalleled completeness and antiquity. And for this talk, I wanted to go back to the beginning. On this slide, you see the first example of all of these important series of rolls. And I'm lucky enough in my job to be able to look at all of these together rather than having to get them out one by one. So here are the first patent roll, close roll, fine roll, and charter roll all together on the table. They range in date from 1199 to 1204, right at the beginning of the period that interests us in this talk. And, you know, we've heard a lot about this period already. We often talk about the chronological span of these series, and their use changes over time, but they endure. But we rarely look at the first and last of them side by side, so hope you'll indulge me if I do that briefly first. And what we see when they are side by side is that the key elements that drive medieval bureaucracy are set very early. There are some changes, but that fundamental structure, how things are written down, how records are kept, is set. The Fine Rolls series at the National Archives runs from 1199, which is this one, to 1648. This is the last one here. Fine rolls are the records of payments made to the monarch for particular favours, perhaps inheriting land or important offices of state. And these rolls were one of the earliest chancery rolls to be established in the last quarter of the 12th century. You'll see how the other chancery rolls borrow some of their format. And you can observe that this first fine roll, for you're looking at it, the left-hand side of my screen, already has the amounts and places in the left margin. This is a really crucial element of medieval record keeping that many of you will have seen in the own materials that you look at. And forgive me if, I'm sure that a lot of you have done your own research with a lot of these records, and so this will be very familiar to you. This structure can also be observed in the charter rolls, which are the records of outgoing royal charters that exist from 1199 on the left-hand side to 1517 on the right. And again, from the creation of these rolls, they already have this referencing system where the name of the person or the institution to whom the charter is granted is in that left-hand margin. You can see the structure barely changes here over 300 years. So the charter rolls and fine rolls finish in the 16th and 17th centuries, but another of the great chancery roll series lasts until the 20th century. Those close rolls, the letter of the monarch issued closed with a seal, runs from 1204 to 1903. I think it's a shame they didn't finish in 1904. The purposes of the rolls changes over that time, with an increasing proportion of the rolls taken up with the recording of private deeds. But as you can see on the slide, again, the broad form remains the same. Although, unfortunately, there aren't any boundary plans in this left-hand medieval example. Wouldn't we love that, to see some more medieval boundary plans? Whereas on this right-hand example, that is a boundary plan from the 1903 roll, right in the middle there. The final great series of chancery rolls that I'll mention briefly before I get into the main topic of my talk is the patent rolls, the only one of these four series to still be accruing at the National Archives. We currently hold patent rolls from 1201 to 2012, spanning 811 years. The 2012 roll, which as you can see, somewhat to my disappointment, is no longer a roll, includes the directions to the Royal Mint to mint the commemorative coins for the Olympics in London. The patent rolls contain commands from the monarch, sealed open. The first patent roll has crosses next to the letters concerning the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is a kind of precursor to those later patent rolls that include all of the names of the letter recipients in the left-hand margin, which you can actually see isn't yet fully developed in this one. So we see all of these outgoing patent letters, but we don't have in that left-hand margin there, we don't have all of the names yet, whereas in later series you'll see that. So why is it that all four of these great chancery roll series begin at the end of the 12th or the very beginning of the 13th century? The creation of these great rolls of state, fine, charter, close, and patent, is a reflection of the increase in written government documents leaving the central court in this period and travelling all over the country. In order to keep track of these documents, these outgoing rolls were created. But one of the things that I've found really enchanting and interesting about all of the talks so far is their focus on the element of chance in history, right? The way that Andrew talked about Parliament coming about, at least partly by a series of circumstances that led not necessarily, but at least partly, coincidentally, to the form of Parliament as we have it today. And it's possible that in the same way, we have one man to thank for these rolls' creation, and therefore for a huge proportion of everything that we know about English, Welsh, Scottish, and Irish, and further afield, medieval history. So Hubert Walter was Archbishop of Canterbury and the Chancellor of King John. We know that he had an interest in record-keeping practices because the first tripartite final concord, where one piece goes to each of the participants, and the third piece, the feat of fines is kept by the Treasury, explicitly notes that it was created under the command of Walter. All of these roll series were created under his leadership of the Royal Chancery. And it's incredible to think that one of these series still exists today. And I can't imagine what he would have thought about it, right, if he were to know. So the most influential book, and many of you will know this, and I'm sure most of you have read it, on the development of a written bureaucracy is Michael Clanchy's From Memory to Written Record. I'm very indebted to the ideas of this book in my talk today, as is, I think, a huge amount of medieval historical scholarship. Clanchy makes the argument that the royal bureaucracy was crucial to the creation of lay literacy. It became important to be able to record things in a written format rather than relying on living memory, at least in part in order to satisfy the central court's demand for accurate record keeping and information. Local gentry have to start keeping records of their own. If the king or local representative asks, how much tax do you owe me? Or what is the exact extent of your land holdings? Or do you really have the right to hold that market? It becomes more and more important to be able to produce a document that answers those questions. The creation of documents centrally fanned out across the country and created documentary subjects, people who used documents, people who relied on them. As Clanchy notes, in his own terms, I've got this quote on the slide, viewed chronologically, England was remarkably document-minded in 1300 compared with the situation in 1100. In the 12th and 13th centuries, as far as titles to property among laymen were concerned in particular, the balance in England had shifted from memory to written record. And as you can see, that's the title of the work itself. Interestingly, Clanchy argues that the creation of these rolls, in particular, those 4 big roll series that I showed you, was more useful for is more useful for historians now than it was for 13th century governing itself. The rolls were hard to consult, as you will know if you've ever tried to unroll one. And it wasn't until later that regular use was made of this vast collection of material. Rather, the making of the records themselves, in Clanchy's words, is an indicator of the efficiency of the government rather than its cause. In other words, the creation of the documents didn't make the government efficient, but the ability to create those documents demonstrated the extensive reach of its power. Throughout the 13th century, the development of written sources allowed the king and his expanding governmental machinery an unparalleled view into people's lives. This interest in the details of community life made it possible for the state to manage resources and people closely. Even more importantly, perhaps, the power of the king projected into people's lives in mundane as well as grand ways. A person far from the bustle of Westminster, who might never see the king in person, would have seen his commands in writing under his great seal. The power of the king split into those many documents that travelled all over England and beyond was magnified rather than diminished. Although, as we've heard in many of our talks and as Paul and Helen have discussed, who was the king was a very live question, right? So, apologies for the pun, as I think some of Paul's puns have rubbed off on me. So at the beginning of December 1274, Edward I sent his bailiff, Adam of Winchester, 2 writs ordering fish and wine for his Christmas feast, which would be held that year at Woodstock in Oxfordshire. He required 21 loads of fish and 20 tons of wine, TUN. A ton of wine was about 950 litres of wine. So this is about 19,000 litres of wine. So after writing this order for Vininta Doli e Vini, 20 tons of wine, the clerk has gone back and added boni above. You can see that here. There you go, it's gone in. Just like Magna Carta was in there, here we are, we've got our good wine. He, or perhaps the king, looking over his shoulder, put good, clearly wanted to ensure that the Christmas wine was to the king's taste. As well as Edward orders, we also hold the bill Adam sent to the king after purchasing his Christmas treats. It includes the expenses for carrying all of the fish and wine to Woodstock, and an entry for the purchase, to go alongside his 19,000 litres of wine, of 400 haddock for 20 shillings. This transaction could have been carried out solely by word of mouth. The king tells his messenger, who tells the bailiff, who procures the goods, sends them back to the king. Edward knows that the order has been carried out because on Christmas Day he sits down, he eats his delicious haddock, he drinks his good wine. Or the king could have sent his command in writing on a wax tablet, or that could then be erased, or on a scrap piece of parchment that wasn't kept. In some ways, there was no need for a record of this exchange. Instead, though, the king's word was transmitted on parchment, which would have originally had his seal attached, although for those of you, this is Special Collections 1, SC1, so they're kind of ancient correspondence series at the National Archives. So they've been taken out by some of my illustrious predecessors and bound into a big book. So the costs of the order are then written up, attached to the original writs, and returned centrally to the offices at Westminster. You can see the holes in the writs on the left-hand side there where they were attached together. Let's see. The king doesn't need to travel, but his command travels around the country. And obviously, this is a silly example, partly because I wanted to tell you about all the wine. But these kind of writs are flying around the country, right, in the 13th century. And on the way, people see and recognize his importance, perhaps similar to the portraits of monarchs on coins or banknotes or stamps, or in the foyer of the National Archives. So documents projected the king's power, as well as acting as a demonstration of the efficiency of his governance. Whether or not you could refer to the documents, and people differ about whether or not, I'm sure people in the audience have views on that, whether or not they actually did. The fact of their existence and your ability to gather so many minute details about the lives of your subjects demonstrates the centralized authority of the monarch. Now I'm going to introduce you to a place which can act as a case study for the 13th century increase in written records. It's a particularly good example, I think, as it appeared as if from nowhere in the 13th century, just as some of these records themselves were appearing for the first time. Some of you may have visited Spurn Point, a sandbank projecting into the Humber estuary, but I don't know whether you will have heard of the island of Ravenser Odd, which arose from the sea in the 1230s and sank again in the 1360s. And as Philip noted, this is something that I'm working on at the moment with my colleague, Professor Emily Robinson at the University of Sussex, who first introduced me to this fascinating place. And she's working with me on an exhibition about the island that's currently travelling around the Humber estuary. So if any of you, particularly online, I imagine, are anywhere near Grimsby Minster, it opens in a couple of weeks. Small plug out of the way. Paul got some out of the way, so I'm doing mine now. So why is this strangely named island a good case study for the explosion in 13th century record keeping? We primarily know about it from central government records. As it sank without a trace, or was washed away over time without a trace, it was probably a sandbank like Spurn Point, although scientists from the University of Hull are looking for the island with various submarines. The vast majority of its local records don't survive. So why and how was the king interested in this new place? How did this interest manifest in the creation of records? And how did those records enable central government to intervene in the new island's short life and enable the islanders and local people to appeal to the king to answer their grievances? So I'm going to introduce you to a whole range of records that stem from the arrival of this island on the scene. And I hope that a lot of you are doing your own research, and I hope that the kinds of records that I'm talking about will also be useful to you in your own local historical journeys. And also, I'd be really excited to hear from you either in the questions or afterwards, about those places and how we first see them in these 13th century records, as we do with so many things that don't show up in Doomsday, for example. A lot of places kind of come onto the map or into the record in this period. So the key things to note about the records of Ravenser Odd is that the majority of the types of records where we can find evidence of the island are 13th century innovations. As I showed you at the beginning of my talk, the first close roll, fine roll, patent roll, and charter roll were all written under John. The first inquisitions post-mortem, which I'll talk about a bit more in a second, were held under Henry III, and the Great Inquisition of the 100 Rolls took place under Edward I. Manorial accounts developed over the 13th century, with the earliest known accounts surviving from the Bishop of Winchester's estate in the 1200s and 1210s. And if Ravenser Odd had emerged from the sea 100 years earlier, we'd know much, much less about its birth and eventual death. One thing that can be traced over time, over the 13th century records, is the island's many, many names. It takes a while for the form of the name that is used contemporarily, Ravenser Odd, to settle as the most common usage. Some versions of the name endure, and some, like Lod, you see that there in the 1264, appear only in one kind of document and only for a brief period of time. If any of you are particularly interested in naming and naming practices, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on Lod. Someone suggested to me that it might be the French version of Odd, Lod, but I'm not sure that's totally convincing. So if anyone has any other ideas, let me know. So the written record allows historians and linguists to trace changes like this over time, which is especially interesting for a new settlement like this one, although also interesting, I think, for the places that you will be working on primarily in this local area. This document, which is the Heir Roll for Yorkshire in 1231, may be the first mention of the island, although in this case not by name. The entry begins by explaining it's about the wreck of the sea. I can see that there. Those of you in Paul's paleography group, by the way, I hope you're, I'm not going to test you, but I hope that you're reading along with me. So it begins by explaining it's about the wreck of the sea, that which is cast ashore by the sea in tidal waters, which the King's has rights over. It explains that a boat was found wrecked near Ravenser, which was the old village on the mainland from which the island Ravenser Odd takes its name. And the boat was taken by William de Fortibus, who was a powerful landowner in the time of Henry III, with lands across the north of England. Evidence from other documents, which we'll come to a little bit later, suggests that this boat was wrecked on the sandbank that became the island of Ravenser Odd. The General Eyre, the travelling criminal court that visited each locality supposedly every 7 years, had probably been around for some years by this point. Evidence from the pipe rolls suggests that heirs were first held in the mid-1160s, and the first extant records survive from 1194, the same time period when all the other roll series began. It isn't clear from the surviving evidence whether this reflects survival rates or whether the justices began to keep records in this form that were gathered in centrally in that point in time. The heir rolls were organised by county, then hundred or wapentake, depending on where you were in the country, and the Ravenser Odd cases fall, therefore, under Holderness. The heir roll is a record of the reach of the King's justice. In theory, a ship couldn't be wrecked on the shore without a record being made somewhere and the King demanding to know about it. We don't have an exact date for the island's birth then, but there are many early mentions in the records that give it a sense of how people at the time felt about its emergence from the sea. The earliest mention of the island that I've found in the National Archives records so far is this 1251 charter, also given to William de Fortibus. Henry III granted William a charter that allowed him to have a market in his manor of Ravenser Odd, ends in a T here, once a week on a Thursday, and an annual fair in September. This charter shows that the island was a valuable asset, worth investing in, and also that by this point, Ravenser Odd was becoming established as a place able to hold a weekly market. After the death of William de Fortibus, the island shows up in yet another spelling, Odd Ravenser, in the extent appended to his Inquisition post-mortem documents. Inquisitions post-mortem, as many of you will know, were local inquiries into valuable properties in order to discover what income and rights were due to the crown and who the heir should be. An extent explains the value of land, normally belonging to a manor. This record on the slide is a summary of the value of de Fortibus's lands across the north of England, and it includes Odd Ravenser in Holderness Wapentake. Inquisitions post-mortem can tell us a lot about the value of lands and their associated rights. In this case, the Inquisition post-mortem gives a value to Ravenser Odd's windmill, which is the first thing that gives us a sense of what this island might have looked like. Given that the island is probably only around 30 years old at this point, the fact that they've already invested in building a windmill is interesting. Although, if any of you have been to Spurn Point, I can confirm that it is still an incredibly windy place, and there is in fact an offshore wind farm there to this day. Inquisitions post-mortem are also a particularly interesting form of record, important for historians as they tell us about land ownership and valuation, and genealogists as they provide a lot of detail on family relationships. At the time, though, these records reminded every landowner that they held their lands by the grace of the king, and that could just as easily be taken away. Isabella de Fortibus, William's widow, takes on the land after his death, as he doesn't have a living male heir. The first definite mention in the close rolls is in March 1265 and relates to Isabella de Fortibus. The king writes to her about her bailiff at Ravenser Odd arresting 2 of his merchants and their ship. The close rolls show the breadth of the king's correspondence and how those commands are issued in writing, and again, thinking about the importance of that written word in this period. Letters under the Great Seal meant that the king could project his power wherever he was in the country, bringing a small piece of that authority of his position to you in the form of the Great Seal, or in this case, to Isabella, the Countess. And sometimes the power of the king came to the localities more directly in the form of the general heir, which I've already discussed relating to that wreck of the sea case. The first Yorkshire general heir case that mentions Ravenser Odd by name is this one from 1268, in this case a land dispute, and the land is referred to as Lod Ravenser. One thing that's interesting about how this place shows up in these established records, and I'd be interested to hear from you about whether this is true of places that you work on, is that it slots in perfectly. So even though in this case it's literally a new place, it falls within the predetermined jurisdictions and sets of rights, in this case of Holderness. The framework of the records, which as you see has been set already at this point, allows for the emergence of new towns and new villages. So it demonstrates the flexibility of these new administrative records. Other Ravenser Odd heir cases also tend to be about the capture of ships on shore, or on one occasion, a body washing up with the tide. A new island by the sea cuts across a range of rights. The king's right to wreck, the manorial lord's right to land in a particular area, previous rights given to other people about land and trade, markets as well. And one of the reasons that Ravenser Odd shows up so quickly in these early written records is the challenge it poses to those existing webs of obligation. Who has the right to exploit this new resource? And the first mention, in fact, of Ravenser Odd in the pattern rolls is also about rights. In this case, who has the right to catch particular birds of prey? It grants Henry de Lacy the right to take goshawks, gyrfalcons, and falcons. If anyone else knows the exact difference between a gyrfalcon and a falcon, let me know later. In the towns of Len, Grimsby, and Ravensord for 2 years from All Saints. These reference place Ravenser Odd within a group of East Coast maritime towns, pairing it with Grimsby, its neighbour over the water. It demonstrates the power of the king over the smallest elements of his kingdom, although an important one, as of course these birds were sought after for falconry and could be very expensive. It also demonstrates that by this date, Ravenser Odd was known as a place to the extent that it could be mentioned in a dispatch to the king, not immediately about it, but kind of relating to something else. And those letters patent mentioning the island demonstrate it was known to the king and in the central chancery. And there were also extant local documents about Ravenser Odd, but these only survive because of that impulse to centralization and the increased importance of documentary proof. When Isabella dies without an heir, her lands revert to the crown, and those lands included Ravenser Odd. When the land reverts to the Crown, all of the documents relating to that land were taken into the Crown's possession, and in this case specifically, those documents included the manorial accounts of Ravenser Odd from 1273 onwards. The documents were taken back into the King's custody as they were part of the evidence of ownership by this point. Owning the records about the land demonstrated who had the responsibility for the land itself. Isabella de Fortibus was a relatively early adopter of manorial accounts in this form. Walter of Henley, who wrote an early treatise on farm management and husbandry, worked for Isabella de Fortibus, and so perhaps she was particularly interested in farm yields and early forms of accounting. Her vast landholdings would also have been easier to manage with written records. And this is something that's very interesting for us to think about, I think, for the kinds of work that you're all doing in this particular local area. For the bailiffs to report back accurately, they would, by this point, have needed to keep at least a record for themselves that they would be able to account to their lord. So the manorial accounts can tell us a lot about Ravenser Odd in this period, and actually this is one of the ongoing pieces of work that Paul and I are doing at the National Archives, is thinking about how these manorial records can be used more widely by local archivists and people doing work on local history. Because although they can seem quite forbidding, as you can see, they're not immediately kind of amenable documents, you can find out a lot about places from these kind of documents. In this case, for example, we discover how much the market is bringing in tolls, that the island had a tannery. I guess a tannery is very smelly, so it's probably a good place to put one. And one, and then later 2, windmills. One year, there were even 4 cows on the island, although I'm unclear how they got them there. It suggests that perhaps Ravenser Odd was an island like Lindisfarne, only at high tide. These documents were important at the time so that the bailiff could report back accurately to his lord, and now they are giving us more of a sense of what these places were like in this period. To understand how people reacted to this emergence, I suppose, we need to go elsewhere. In 1274, as many of you again will know, King Edward I commissioned this huge inquiry into the liberties of England, the special rights enjoyed by people or places that derived from royal grants. The records of this inquiry are now in a series at the National Archives known as the 100 Rolls, after the 100, the administrative division by which the inquiry was organised. Ravenser Odd makes several appearances in these rolls, and the remarks about it are not complimentary. By this time, as we just found out, Isabella de Fortibus was the lady of the manor, and people had specific complaints about her. From the 1251 Charter, we know that they had the right to hold a market and a fair on Ravenser, but the activities alleged by the people of Holderness, the area north of the River Humber, go far beyond these rights. They said the Countess's bailiff was charging people tolls on the fish that they brought to shore there and building a port that was harming the other ports nearby. And they also said, interestingly, that the island was acting like a borough. And we've heard in Andrew's talk the kind of importances of places becoming boroughs in terms of their relationship with Parliament. Exercising rights that it didn't have, seizing people's goods if they didn't pay their debts, and holding a court it wasn't entitled to. This might sound like merely complaints from disgruntled neighbours, but we do know, in fact, from the manorial accounts, that the Countess was bringing in a lot of money from holding a court at this point. In fact, it was Ravenser Odd's most profitable activity. The people of Grimsby were particularly angered by the new island, and in the 100 Rolls, they give us the first account of how it came to be. That 40 years and more ago, by casting up of the sea, sand and stones accumulated, on which accumulation William de Fortibus, then Earl of Albemarle, began to build a certain town, which is called Ravenser Odd, and it is an island. The sea surrounds it. So that gives us a time frame for the emergence of the island from the sea. 40 years ago, at the time the 100 Rolls were compiled, so about 1235. It also suggests that the island came about gradually by an accumulation of stones and sand over some time, and that William de Fortibus claimed it for himself. Whether he was right to do that or not is one of the questions in this great survey. The 100 Rolls were an excellent example of the reach of central government, and central government documentation in particular, into the lives of ordinary people. The king, it appeared, was interested in what your town thought. Your grievances about your new neighbour were listened to and recorded. Although, as we shall see, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were resolved. Sometime before 1290, and we've heard quite a bit about petitions today already as well, these parliamentary petitions, although not always sent to Parliament. The people of Grimsby had had enough of their upstart new neighbour. They complained about their neighbours taking of rights that did not belong to them to that was recorded in the 100 Rolls, but apparently nothing had been done. And they petitioned the king directly in this petition, asking that 20 men from Ravenser Odd be summoned to the Court of King's Bench, the highest criminal court in the land, which we've also already heard about briefly today, to answer to the king's justices. They alleged that Ravenser Odd was taking trade from Grimsby unjustly, intercepting merchants who were trying to land at Grimsby. And this appeal to central government is to resolve a local issue is interesting in relation to our wider question about how the written record permeated into ordinary people's lives. Grimsby was already a royal borough, and the upstart New Island was not. The surviving petitions from both places show there was a real belief in this period that the king's governance stretched as far as the Humber estuary, and that bringing questions of day-to-day survival to the king's attention in writing was worth doing. The case then was taken to the Court of King's Bench. 2 justices were sent up to Grimsby to gather evidence in the case. The evidence was taken at Grimsby. You can see that in this inquisition here. And the case is then set up by the Inquisition. It's been called to investigate the hindrances and forestallings of ships which have been accustomed to come and harbour at Grimsby. The setup of the record therefore foregrounds its liveness, the fact that it's the record of testimony taken from a group of people at a particular place on a particular day. So we can imagine, in this case, the grumpy townspeople of Grimsby being given the opportunity to officially complain about their ill treatment at the hands of this new town. The live nature of the legal event is important here, I think, because it demonstrates the limits of that written word. 2 judges need to go up and ask the people of Grimsby in person in Grimsby about the situation. They can't or don't want to send their testimony in a written format or through their representative. And in the Inquisition, they give us 2 different accounts of how the island became a town. Some of them say this, that 40 years ago, a certain ship was cast away on Ravenser Odd, you'll remember that from before, when there was no house built, which ship a certain person appropriated to himself, and from it made a cabin that he inhabited for some time. They're talking about events which at this point they say happened 40 years ago, before 1290, which would have been around 1250, although as we've also seen, the people of Grimsby also said that it was about 40 years ago in 1274, which would have been around 1235. And I think this is an interesting case of the limitations of memory reflected in that written record. At the time, it seems, no one would have thought to return to the 100 Rolls to check what was said then about the emergence of the island. But now, almost 750 years later, it's possible for us to put those 2 stories side by side. And the narrative, I think, in this Inquisition also reminds us of that wrecked ship in the 1231 air roll. Could that ship have been the ship on this new island that someone starts to live in that is referred to here? Elsewhere in the same document, we found another version that in the time of King Henry III, through the casting up of the sea, a certain small island was born, which is called Ravenser Odd, distanced from the town of Grimsby by the space of 1 tide. And I focused on these 2 moments in this record because I think we can hear the voices of the people in this story behind this formal Latin text. The island, rather than appearing or washing up or accumulating, nata fuit, right, was born out of the waves, a very poetic turn of phrase for a legal text about trading rights. We then discover that the town is 1 tide's distance from Grimsby. Tide is not a word that exists in classical Latin. It comes into medieval Latin from Middle English in the early 13th century, but it isn't a unit of measurement. So how far is a tide? This can only be understood, I think, in the context of that local knowledge of the tides of the North Sea flowing in and out of the Humber. It's an echo of a deposition in English preserved in the Latin record. Although I'm noting the importance of the spoken word in this testimony here, of course, we know about this because of the written record, and again, the importance of that central government repository, which still exists, is demonstrated once again. The Inquisition led to this court case in the following year at the Court of King's Bench, and the people of Grimsby repeated their complaint, saying they were suffering and couldn't pay their taxes because the new island was arresting merchants and compelling them to go to Ravenser Odd rather than Grimsby. The people of Ravenser Odd replied Grimsby wasn't paying a fair price for their fish, so it was no wonder that people wanted to trade with Ravenser Odd instead. Unfortunately for Grimsby, in the end, the King's Court was not interested in their local trade dispute, and the court ruled that the island had not done anything that went against the King's peace. Ravenser Odd, in this case, had won the day. And after their victory in court, they pressed their advantage and petitioned the King to be made a borough. Becoming a borough would give the town a range of advantages, including managing their own local justice, exemption from certain taxes, and the ability to leave land and property to whoever they wanted. On the 1st of April 1299, April Fool's Day, Edward I granted their request, issuing them a charter confirming their new rights and responsibilities. And Ravenser Odd shares this birthday with a much more well-known borough in the present, Kingston upon Hull, whose charter is copied immediately above Ravenser Odd's in the National Archives records. And I've included here on the left-hand side the original borough charter of Hull, which is still extant, to show what Ravenser Odd's charter would have looked like. The King's power was projected through this physical token of his grant given to the island and given to the town of Hull at the same time, and the town ended the 13th century basking in the King's favour. So looking at the emergence of this new place across the 13th century, the explosion of documentary sources becomes apparent. Ravenser Odd's jurisdictional oddities, who has the right to a completely new place, means that it's particularly caught up in these webs of new kinds of writing. The fact that the first mention of the island by name was in a charter shows too the importance of getting physical confirmation of rights, even in the local area. In fact, in the 14th century, the early 14th century, there's a particularly good example of this. The burgesses of Ravenser Odd are involved in a court case at King's Bench. Again, this time, the case is about whether or not the island was allowed to seize people's goods. They maintain that they were, as they have this borough charter from the King. The justices of the bench tell them to bring their charter to the court to demonstrate their rights, and it's then copied into the plea rolls of the King's Bench. Their written charter, gained decades earlier, had to be produced physically to prove their rights. Documents were not only being produced, demonstrating the efficiency and power of centralised government, but also by this point being relied upon for documentary proof. The transition from memory to written record that Clancy talks about was at this point perhaps complete. Thank you. I think I'll stop to time.
Thank you, Kathryn. That's brilliant and wonderful to have a practical example of how the increase of written record can be traced through one particular community. David is keen. David is very keen.
Oh, gosh.
I also have a question, but David...
Please.
I just wanted to say what a wonderful talk that was. And
thank you.
It's just terrific the way you put together the all that material about Ravenser Odd. I wonder how you got the idea. So that's one question. Just three very, very quick points about
Please.
it. Michael Clancy's book, Memory to Written Record, absolutely wonderful book. But of course, Anglo-Saxon historians said from the start that he hugely underestimated the amount of a written record under the Anglo-Saxons, and he came to acknowledge that. So some people have said to me it should have been called written record to written record. Second point is Hubert Walter. I yield to no one in my admiration for him, but a very, very good case can be made, and H.D. Richardson made it first for saying that he didn't invent the Chancery rolls, and they went back considerably earlier than that. The third point is I think Michael also underestimated the extent to which the Chancery rolls were
consulted.
Of a utility in the 13th century. He underestimated how often they were consulted, and he also underestimated just simply the power of the record itself.
I think so.
So that ministers knew that what they'd been ordered to do had been recorded, so you know, they could be held to account. So I think Michael got that wrong too, but it's a great book. Wonderful.
Yeah, it is a wonderful book, and I think I would agree with you there. And I think that one of the things that I said was I think the writing itself, whether or not anyone looks at it, has the power. I think, and I think I would totally agree with you there in the sense that if you are in this case at Ravenser Odd in this island very far from the court, and you still think that your best bet is to go central with these kind of local concerns. And those of you who are working on the marches will know that that was very, very common here too, right? People are kind of returning to those central documentation. And I think that that is a really fascinating example of what you say. And the sheer weight of the rolls, both physically, we know they weigh a lot, but also in people's minds, right? That even if people weren't going to consult them, the fact that they could consult them if they wanted was, I think I agree with you, of great importance. And so they had this weight at the time, which I agree with you. I'm not sure that Mike fully kind of bears in mind. In terms of my work on this island, which, as you can tell, I think by my talk about it, I'm very fond of. So I actually, although my mum's from Hull, I had no idea about it. I didn't know it was, I'm a medieval historian, didn't know anything about it until I met my colleague Emily Robinson at the International Medieval Congress a couple of years ago. And she said, oh, you're a medievalist. She's actually works on British politics. She's working on the kind of afterlives of the island. There's a board game. There's a Dungeons and Dragons set up. There are 4 bands, I think. People use the name. There's a, I would say, not that good novel about some Vikings, some ahistorical Vikings. There's a lot of post work on this, and she asked me, you're just starting at the National Archives, what have you got? And there was a great book called Lost Towns of the Humber, written by J.R. Boyle, who was actually the archivist at Hull History Centre, or the Hull Archives, as it then was in the 19th century, where he did some of this work from published editions. But because a lot of the calendars hadn't been published at that point, no one had actually looked at the manorial records. And I'm still going through, I have to tell you, the air records. So I know that it's the earliest reference, but I still have some years to go through. And so I became kind of obsessed with the idea that I could pin this island down. But as you'll all know, the more references you find, the more references there could be. And so until I've looked at every 13th century document where there could possibly be a reference to it, I won't know that I've got them all. So that is an ongoing project. But thank you so much, David.
Right, there are 3 people who'd like to, well, very, very quick.
Just to link our talks together, Kathryn. The Parliament of January 1327 is the only time when Ravenser sends members to Parliament, and one of them is called Thomas Le Taverner, so they're probably a tavern of some sort on Ravenser. So there you go.
Very good, and also very interesting because by the 1360s, and this is, I guess, the kind of very brief story of the death of the island, they petitioned the king throughout the 14th century, saying that the island is literally sinking. At one point, they get 500 oaks from the forest to try and shore it up. It doesn't work. And so they only have that single parliament because by 1360, the final manorial record is 1355. It's just the name of the island with a blank space. So it's disappeared again.
And nobody mentioned climate change.
Interesting, yeah. It's an interesting question.
There's 3 people who want to ask questions. If I could just ask that they are sort of fairly quick, please, because people will want their coffee.
Hello, I just wanted to say that I was born and grew up on the banks of the Humber. And I've looked down the Humber for donkey's years, and I've never heard of this island. When did it start? When did it all start, this information about it? And where can I get more?
Oh, well, so I did, I would say that it's kind of emerged over the last 10 to 15 years, more work on the island. So those of you will know, if you're looking down the Humber, this is right at the end of the Humber Spurn Point. We did put on an exhibition recently at Hull History Centre, which is now online, but also I can send you some more material. There's also a very good book by a historian called Phil Matheson, a local historian, about Ravenser Odd, which I would recommend. If anyone wants any references, do feel free to ask me. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathryn. Brilliant story. very mundane question.
Please.
Can you hear me?
No mundane
It's
questions.
all in Latin. I know that's because of the church, but when did it become, I mean, was that Henry VIII when the church was debunked?
Great question. So in terms of our big roles series, they actually, where are we? There we are. They're actually all in Latin, most of them until about 1733, at least the legal series. And there's a brief period in the interregnum, so between Charles I and Charles II, where they all switch into English very briefly, and then they all switch back into Latin again, slightly surprisingly. You'd think that once they'd done the switch, they'd stick to English, but they absolutely don't. So the big roles series are in Latin right through until the 18th century. So that is a big moment in kind of constitutional change. So they kind of change over into that English, which is really it's interesting, I think, at that point, because it's a moment where England is kind of exerting itself on the world stage, right? And a moment where English has a very different status to the status that it had previously, but also where you have to have a much bigger bureaucracy that may not all be public school educated, right? That may not all either have been a clerk or educated in a school where, where I didn't learn Latin at school. I didn't learn Latin until my master's. So many of you will have learned Latin at school. It was much more common, but it's getting less and less common now. And it was exactly the same then. So you need a lot of people, right, to create a bureaucracy. And we also have a lot of French, but not in the roles. So the petitions are actually mostly in French. One last question.
But it's a very quick point about
Please.
gyrfalcons. They may have been gyrfalcons, Gyr falcons. They come from the Arctic, Greenland, I think, and usually just seen rarely in the Hebrides. The variant in the UK is largely white, I understand. So they're probably rather glamorous falcons, and I think still bred.
Oh, how lovely.
That is correct. And the sort of problem with the distinction is that falcon is a generic term for a type of bird.
Of course.
So whereas a gyrfalcon is a specific bird,
A specific...
falcon is a generic. So
Is the kind of-
covering peregrine falcons.
Yeah, so the kind of distinction between hawk and sparrowhawk is a
Yes.
similar...
Yeah.
Lovely. Okay, great.
yes.
I knew someone in the audience would know, you see.
Right.
A very learned audience. Thank you all so much. It's been lovely.
Thank you very much, Kathryn. One thought that occurred to me, which arose from a couple of comments that you made about the volume and the wealth of information that the government was beginning to hold about people and places, then it just brought to mind some of the current responses to the government's proposals for an ID card, and people saying, but just think about all the information that the government will have about you. Well, sorry, mates, that ship sailed 800 years ago. Thank you very much, Kathryn.